Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to this special vacation edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm continuing to do my show remotely, and I'm doing a very important show today because it's about a very scary bill. And with me is my guest, Evan Greer, who is the Deputy Director of Fight for the Future. How you doing, Evan?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Well, I wanted to talk to you about this bill that you sent an email about today called the Earn It Act. Can you explain what this bill is and why we should be so afraid of it?
Sure. So the Earn It Act is really sort of a perfect storm or a coming together of two very bad ideas that have been gaining steam in Congress. So one is using Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act as sort of a political lever to push tech companies to do things that we want them to do. And then the other is the idea that we need law enforcement to be able to put backdoors in encryption technology, and that that's somehow the only way to keep people safe. Both of those ideas are deeply misguided. And in fact, what this legislation would really do is it would allow the government to put a backdoor into things like encrypted messaging apps like Signal. If Facebook does go ahead and implement end-to-end encryption on their messenger, this could prevent them from doing something like that. And what it would essentially do is limit security for everyone while allowing bad actors, the folks that this bill is supposed to be reining in, to continue using encryption, which will always be available. Really what this does is prevent the most popular services that people use, sort of creates a mechanism by which to prevent them from having strong end-to-end encryption for their users.
Now, how is this bill similar to SOPA and PIPA, which you successfully fought a few years ago, and also FOSTA and SESTA, a fight that you guys lost? Describe what those bills were sold to do versus what they would have, or in the case of FOSTA and SESTA, actually did do.
Yeah, for sure. So quickly, just to explain how the Earn It Act works, or how they say it works. The idea is that the Department of Justice would be able to put together a set of quote unquote best practices, and then companies would have to follow those best practices, or they could risk having their protections under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act revoked. Now, the Communications Decency Act in Section 230 is the law that essentially allows all user-generated content on the internet. So when you go and you post this video on Facebook, Facebook is not responsible for what you say in this video. And they shouldn't be, because you and I are the ones saying what is in this video. If Facebook was responsible for every piece of user-generated content, that would essentially allow the government to shut down almost all of the online forums where people are able to express themselves and upload their own pieces of content. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is one of the most important pieces of legislation that has enabled online freedom of expression. In terms of how the Earn It Act is similar to SOPA PIPA, it's really similar in the sense that it's just a deeply misguided legislation that says it does one thing, but in fact does another. So with SOPA and PIPA, it was intended or was sold to us as legislation to prevent online piracy. So people stealing and downloading music and movies and things like that. What it would have done in practice is it would have allowed the US government to essentially shut down any website that they wanted to, just because they linked to some kind of infringing content. So if you have a website where you have a variety of political viewpoints and someone posts a link there that links to a pirated video, the US government could have shut down your entire website. The Earn It Act is similar in the sense that it would allow the Department of Justice, which currently is run by Bill Barr, and which has repeatedly shown that it wants to put backdoors in encryption technology, to say, oh, you didn't do one of the things we told you to do, we're going to strip you of your CDA 230 protections and shut you down. What's kind of incredible about this particular attack on CDA 230 is that CDA 230 is actually also the law that allows tech companies to do reasonable amounts of moderation. This is what allows a company like Reddit to say, you know what, we decided we're going to take down this horrific subreddit that is solely dedicated to shaming women. for example. They're allowed to do that. It is within their First Amendment rights to moderate content on their website as they see fit. And Section 230 is actually what prevents them from getting sued for making that decision. So in a funny way, lawmakers are continually beating up on Section 230, saying that that's the law that allows tech companies to allow all kinds of awful things on their site, when in fact it's actually the law. It is the law that allows free expression on the internet. It's also the law that allows tech companies to moderate content in a responsible way. So revoking that law would not kind of take the bad things off the internet, as folks like to say. It would either basically cause companies to wholesale remove almost all user-generated content, or to become completely hands-off and say, well, we're not going to moderate anything, because if we moderate anything, then we could get in trouble. Now, sorry, there's a lot here, but you asked about. Go ahead.
Right, before we get into that, let me ask you about that, what you just mentioned, because I actually want to sue Facebook. I want to do a class action suit against Facebook for constantly censoring speech. And I know that they are not the government, and so that they are allowed to do that, and that I probably don't have a good First Amendment case for this. However, if 70% of people get their news and information from Facebook and Google right now, they are sort of acting like the public square. And therefore, they should either have rules put on them, like be regulated like a public utility, so that they could regulate based on time, place, and manner, but not based on content. Because what they're doing, at least in the case of Facebook, is they're censoring left-wing activists and not right-wing activists. So where does this Section 230 come into that? Because this is the first I'm learning about that.
Yeah, so it starts to get really complicated. And what I would say, Lauren, on that point is that I think it's really important that we look at the underlying business model of a company like Facebook. Facebook wants people to think that they're a town square where people have conversations, but really what Facebook is an advertising engine. And it's that algorithm where they are artificially amplifying certain content and suppressing other content, but really they don't really have a political motivation to it. And I think that's where people get tripped up. Conservatives say that Facebook is censoring conservatives. Leftists say that Facebook is censoring leftists. The reality is Facebook is censoring things that don't make Facebook money. Facebook amplifies content that they think people want to see and rams it down the throats of the people who are most susceptible to it. So it's that underlying business model, that surveillance capitalist business model of harvesting people's data and using it to show them whatever Facebook thinks will get engagement. And the algorithm doesn't really care. It's not a leftist algorithm or a right-wing algorithm. It's just a money-making algorithm. And so, of course, fringe content, including critical content and left-wing content, is going to get ignored by that algorithm because it's looking for things that it think will make money. And so from my perspective, I think what we need to do is look at, things like antitrust, recognizing that the fact that these companies have simply grown so large that they are acting as almost de facto governments, and the policies that they put in place around moderation are sort of almost de facto First Amendment, protections. And I think we need to grapple with that. But I think from where I would sit, rather than messing with Section 230, which really is kind of a core law that has enabled so much of the good things that we like about the internet, I would start looking at banning micro-targeted advertising, demanding and requiring full transparency so that we know, why did Facebook take this post and make it go viral and take this post and make it so no one saw it? They should have to explain why they make those decisions and how they make those decisions. If we had some transparency into that, then I think we would start to see a lot more equitable, and that we would start to be able to push Facebook to be more what they say they are, which is a town square, rather than what they really are, which is a machine that is designed to sell advertising.
Okay, now go back to what you were starting to say about the two other bills.
Sure. So you asked about SESTA FOSTA, and you're exactly right to ask about that. It is very similar to the Earn It Act in the sense that it used Section 230 as sort of a political lever to and was sold as a bill that was supposed to prevent sex trafficking. When really what it ended up doing was it caused Tumblr to remove all adult content, including cartoons and creative content, from their platform. It's been, seen repeatedly as something that has actually harmed people who are being trafficked or people in the sex trade. And really, what it ended up doing was, again, there's this false idea that like people are using Facebook to do horrific things. People who are doing horrific things on the internet can afford to go buy an end-to-end encrypted service or use a service that's based in another country. If you ban end-to-end encryption from Facebook messages, that just harms, low-level drug dealers, activists, ordinary people who are trying to keep their messages protected. And the folks that are doing really, really bad stuff are going to be able to go find another way to do it. And I think that's what's so important that people understand, is that this isn't a bill that's going to make anyone safer. It's actually going to make a lot of people less safe, because that encryption is what keeps people's communications safe. It's what protects people who are domestic abuse victims from their abusers. It's what protects so many of our sensitive infrastructures. And when you start to undermine that encryption technology, you can't create a backdoor that's only for the good guys. That just doesn't work. Once you create a backdoor in encryption technology, it can and will be exploited by the bad guys as well. And that's why security experts and human rights experts from across the political spectrum have been warning for years that putting backdoors in encryption technology is actually something that makes people less safe, not more safe.
Well, from what I've read, the sex trafficking and the child pornography angle is really what attracted the lawmakers to pass that bill, and is really what is attracting the lawmakers to favorably consider the Earn It Act. So what would you say are some solutions, before we talk about the fight against this bill, what would you say are the solutions to their concerns?
For
or
sure.
are there none?
For sure. I mean, and you're absolutely right. I mean, legislation, no politician wants to say, I didn't put my name on the bill for protecting children, right? And so that is sort of a political play that has been made repeatedly by law enforcement when they're pushing for legislation that undermines people's rights. They will always say, they will always point to the most egregious things as the reason for it. Look at the USA Patriot Act, right? Which was said to be necessary to prevent terrorism. So, we've seen this again and again as an argument that's made by law enforcement. But if you listen to, parent groups and, folks that really do support, I really think it's important that we recognize that these are broader societal problems, and we need to look at them in a broad way. We can't fix this, something that is kind of deep and broken in our society, by just beating up on a specific tech company or tweaking a specific law. I think it takes, more than that. That said, for lawmakers that are looking to do something about this, there is alternative legislation. Senator Ron Wyden has introduced a bill that would just increase funding for investigation and support for child support advocates and things like that. That's an alternative that makes a lot more sense to me than a bill that would do nothing to protect children, and in fact would instead undermine the encryption technology that protects people's human rights around the world.
Now, the tech industry was more powerful when it joined you to defeat SOPA and PIPA. What changed prior to the FOSTA-SESTA fight, specifically regarding Facebook, who capitulated on that? And what is their stance regarding the Earn It Act?
Sure. I mean, people have often kind of pointed to SOPA PIPA as if it was, Google and Wikipedia that won the fight, when in fact it was really grassroots activists that built the groundwork that then, those large companies, were sort of able to build on top of. I'm not going to pretend that their opposition didn't make a big difference, but certainly, those companies occupy a different space in the world. We, as a organization that works on internet freedom, spend a lot more of our time attacking and going after those companies and holding them accountable than, allying with them, as we maybe did sometimes, in a strange bedfellows sort of way around issues like net neutrality. So they've certainly are much less popular in the public eye and in Washington, D.C. than they used to be, but they're also kind of taking it from all sides. And I think one of the things we're seeing a lot is politicians are sort of using internet policy as a political football, right? So you see Trump saying, oh, the social media companies are censoring me. And you see Biden being like, I want the social media companies to censor more stuff. And it's just sort of a back and forth, and we're all caught in the middle, and our basic rights are at stake. There's nothing more dangerous for freedom of expression and basic rights than when politicians are kind of yelling at social media companies to like just do something without actually being specific and getting real about what kinds of policies that we are talking about. And so I think, you know, part of what that has led to is the companies will sort of turn on each other. And that's what really happened with Facebook and Sesta Fosta. You know, it's really came down to, from what I've read, basically Sheryl Sandberg was like, you know what, I don't want another fight on my hands. Let's just give them this. And, you know, in the end, they don't really care about the marginalized people who are going to be hurt by these types of policies. They have the lawyers to pour through it and figure out how to comply and make sure that they'll be okay. It's the smaller platforms and smaller companies that, and the individual creators and individual people's basic rights that end up getting hurt in the process. And that's why I think we can't just sit back and hope that, you know, big tech company lobbyists are going to save us from legislation like the Earn It Act. It needs to be up to us to fight and make it known to our lawmakers that we're not willing to accept a kind of a blatant sneak attack on our basic rights to freedom of expression and internet privacy, and we're not going to let them kind of ram that through Congress, you know, while no one's watching.
Yes, and to point out the other fight that they were in at that time was the fact they were being accused of allowing Russia to, you know, use their platform to infiltrate our election, which has been completely disproved. So what are the tactics that you successfully employed to kill SOPA PIPA? What are you employing this time? And how can viewers, what should viewers do right now if they want to help kill this bill?
For sure. You know, you kind of go back to the old school a little bit when we're dealing with internet policy like this. We think of these as like these very high-tech fights. The thing that stopped SOPA PIPA was phone calls. We drove about 8 million phone calls to Congress in a single day. Their phones were melting off the hook, and the next day they woke up scared out of their minds, and, you know, the bill went from having this much support to having this much support in about 48 hours. You know, there was a lot of work that went into making that happen. The SOPA strike, where we got lots, you know, tens of thousands of websites to black out to sound the alarm. The reality is there aren't really tens of thousands of websites anymore, right? That's part of the problem that we're dealing with, is that because of centralization, we now see, you know, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and YouTube control such an enormous amount of online awareness. But we still have ways to get the word out. And the biggest thing that people can do is to write to and call their senators, especially senators on the Judiciary Committee who are going to be making a decision about this bill soon. But your own senators really need to hear from you. And if they start hearing, you know, I think people tend to think, look, you know, politicians, they don't care about us. You know, they don't care what we think. And you're right, they don't care about you and they don't care what you think, but they do care about getting reelected. And so when they start to hear from lots and lots and lots of people, I am pissed off about this, I do not want this bill to pass, that creates some friction for them. And they have to start weighing the political calculus of, is it worth it to support this and take the backlash that I'm going to take? So, you know, you can take this very pragmatically. You don't have to believe that we have a functioning democracy. Recognize that when they start getting those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of phone calls, it makes a difference. So we have a petition at noearnitact.org. Super easy. You can fill out the form there, write a letter to both your senators, and then call them. That's the simplest thing that everyone can and should do. We've also really seen it going viral over the last couple weeks, especially with so many people focused on the protests in the streets and people starting to download apps like Signal to protect their communications. A lot of young activists are paying attention to this right now. So if you have a social media platform, if you have a YouTube channel, you know, just getting the word out about the bill is really, really helping right now. We've gotten more than 500,000 people have taken action through our petition in the last week alone. That's incredible. We don't see numbers like that very often. So this is something where we have a real opportunity to do some good. And I really believe that we can stop this bill if people keep speaking out and keep sounding the alarm about it.
Well, my senators are Kamala Harris and Dianne Feinstein. And as you know, Kamala Harris took a lot of heat on the campaign trail for FOSTA and SESTA and shutting down back pages when she was Attorney General from the same-sex workers. She obviously cares about public opinion because she's still angling to be Biden's vice president. But Dianne Feinstein, as we know, is in her last term, and she's pretty conservative. Are you going to be doing what I think you did last time, which is highlighting the representatives that we need to hit and focusing in on them?
Absolutely. So, if folks follow us on social media or get on our email list, we're always trying to make it as easy as possible for people to make their voices heard to the lawmakers that need to hear from them at any given time. So, we're not really an inside DC group. We're a tech policy group that has no one in DC and no one in San Francisco. That's kind of, the joke we like to tell ourselves. But we work closely with groups who are on the Hill, and we do communicate with offices of allied senators who are, in the right place on this. And we hear intel from them where they'll say, you really got to put some pressure on so-and-so, like they're making their decision right now. And we always try to relay that out to folks and let them know where to direct attention. But the reality is, again, look, politicians are political animals. So wherever they may stand personally, ideologically on a certain issue, like you mentioned with Senator Feinstein, definitely makes a difference. But in the end, if they get enough pressure, they will fold. And there's so many political calculations that they're making at any given time. We are in an election year. And so, I think I wouldn't give up on anyone. And anyone, especially that's on the Judiciary Committee, I think is worth getting a phone call from you right now.
Okay, now my final question is, can you tell the viewers what other fights Fight for the Future is working on, and also where we stand on net neutrality? Because you were a big player. That's how I first came to know you back in, I think it was 2014.
Absolutely. Gosh, there's just so much going on right now. And again, I just give such a tremendous amount of credit to the folks that have been out there in the streets, frankly, risking their lives to make their voices heard, who've just been moving tectonic plates on issues of policing and surveillance over the last couple of weeks. I just have an incredible amount of gratitude for the mountains that folks have moved. And that has really opened up some new opportunities. We're seeing huge renewed interest in Congress around the issue of facial recognition surveillance. Amazon and Microsoft and IBM all just distanced themselves from it. Amazon and Microsoft are saying they won't sell it to police for a year. IBM is saying that they're totally out of the facial recognition business. Now, look, for those companies, that's largely a public relations play. But the reality is that is hugely symbolic of the fact that we've made facial recognition politically toxic, and companies are recognizing that they're better off staying away from it right now than they are developing it. So we're pushing, we have a coalition with dozens of other groups at banfacialrecognition.com where you can take action. We're calling on Congress to enact an outright ban on law enforcement use of facial recognition. And I think, a year ago, everyone said that was impossible. It is looking increasingly likely that we could see legislation like that in the coming weeks. We're also working to prevent the reauthorization of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. This is something where, it's kind of amazing to see Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff on TV talking about how Donald Trump is a dangerous, authoritarian, fascist president when they've spent the last 2 weeks doing almost everything in their power to reauthorize these domestic surveillance programs that will allow Donald Trump and Bill Barr to spy on activists, journalists, religious minorities, anyone else that they want, and actively undermining attempts to even just get basic amendments in place that would have protected people's privacy. That said, again, things have shifted on that. It is going to be politically harder for Democrats to ram through a reauthorization of the Patriot Act in this political climate. So we have a real opportunity to continue fighting for amendments there or slowing down the process. We have a site, saveinternetprivacy.org, where you can write to folks about the Patriot Act. We're working on Zoom. Zoom said that they were only going to offer end-to-end encryption on paid accounts, which again plays into this bogus narrative as if in Zoom's world, some drug cartel boss is like, dang, if only we could afford $19.99 a month, we could have gotten that end-to-end encryption and done some really bad stuff. which is just totally silly. They're leaving the folks who need that encryption the most, political activists, folks that are organizing meetings, people that are talking to their therapists and healthcare providers on Zoom. They're leaving them vulnerable while offering their corporate clients meaningful protection. So we've been fighting to encourage them to offer end-to-end encryption to everyone. And then we're continuing to push for Amazon to cancel these 1,000+ police partnerships that Amazon has forged between their Ring doorbells and police departments. So we're working on that, both pushing on Amazon to pull back on those, but also pushing on local elected officials, city councilors, and mayors. That can be part that we're seeing, ordinances coming out in cities across the country around police reform. We want to make sure that surveillance and reining in the surveillance state is part of that. It's sort of the more hidden aspect of police violence. It's not as visible as some of the other types of police violence, but it is such a foundation of abusive policing in our country. So we want to make sure that surveillance reform and reining in government surveillance is part of that movement as it grows.
Now, let me ask you a question regarding contact tracing that is so important to do during the coronavirus pandemic. I did a show with Shahid Buttar, who is taking on Nancy Pelosi, and he used to be with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In fact, he may still be, he may just be on leave. But we talked about privacy regarding what all these other countries are doing. And in South Korea, they were able to test and do contact tracing of their population because it's a much more communitarian society. They don't care so much about the individual freedoms and individual civil liberties. They care more about the collective society. And so they were not so resistant to this. And Shahid was saying there is a way to do these things to protect the public health where you don't, personally identify people, but, still protect these liberties. So what is your position on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, we have a similarly nuanced position on it. And I think, in the age of pandemic, it's important that we not just wave the flag and say whatever our soundbite is. We need to really be thoughtful about what practices may help save people's lives and then weigh that. I think one thing I've said repeatedly is that public health experts are not human rights experts, and vice versa. I am not a public health expert. Right. And so I think we need to have open and transparent conversations where security experts, public health experts, human rights experts, and privacy experts work together to determine what are ways that we can do contact tracing without potentially opening up, huge types of government surveillance that could be used to violate people's rights. And I think there are ways to do it. I think it's also important to just recognize that, contact tracing has been traditional contact tracing, where basically an army of individuals who get hired to do it call people who have tested positive and ask them to voluntarily give them information about who else they may have exposed so that they can then call those people and tell them that they should get tested. That is the tried and true way of doing it. And it also provides a whole bunch of people with jobs at a time when people really need it. I think we should start there before we start kind of putting our faith into untested techno solutions that, maybe will help and they're worth investigating. But, beyond even the privacy concerns, I think, this is a serious situation. And, again, not as a public health expert, but just observing it from, with common sense, it makes sense to me to use the tried and true methods that are directed by medical experts rather than putting our faith in big tech companies to figure out some new solution that's totally untested and might not even work, and might open the door to privacy and human rights violations at a scale that would be really dangerous. So I think it's worth talking about, but I think again the biggest thing is we just sort of need everyone in the room, and we've been really encouraging folks to listen to public health experts, but also to ensure that civil liberties experts are there, because it shouldn't be it shouldn't have to be their job to worry about that. Their job is to figure out, here's what we think will slow the spread of the virus. My job is to be like, hey, that sounds like a cool idea, but have you thought about this, right? And, we each need to be able to do our jobs and work together.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, Evan. You're always a pleasure to talk to. I love every fight you get involved with. And that's why they call your organization Fight for the Future. And let me just tell my viewers, the show that I'm working on right now is with Laurel Krauss, whose sister Allison Krauss was one of the 4 students shot dead at Kent State 50 years ago. And we could see what's happening with the militarized police right now, shooting the protesters with supposedly non-lethal weapons, which are actually pretty lethal. If you look at, Sarah Grossman, who has asthma and died 2 days after being tear gassed. I mean, these are chemical weapons that we go to war over. We literally took out Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and are trying to take out Bashar al-Assad for gassing their own people. Gassing their own people is such a crime that, we're ready to go into a regime change war, and yet our government is basically gassing our own people every time they're peacefully protesting. So I'm working on that show. I don't know when it's going to be, but as usual, I will end my show with stay safe, stay home, except to protest, wearing masks, and keep fighting.